apologies to keep the audience waiting. I know we've overrun a little bit, but we promise to keep you engaged, and we will try and cover up the run rate of the overs already lost, and hopefully entertain you in these no longer dismal times. We are, of course, improving, getting out of the pandemic, but healthcare and pharmaceuticals have really, attained center stage during these troubled times. There have been various challenges that have beset the industry. There have been new learnings from these, the challenges that have been thrown at the industry, both at the practical level, the from a digital technology and march thereof, sort of that level, the addressing of different types of liability. There have been, different types of litigations that companies have faced, and clearly this has been an interesting time to be engaged with this industry at the legal, regulatory, policy, ethics level. So without wasting any further time, my first question will be directly to Meera. These, as I just said, we've been last 1.5 years have been quite interesting because they've thrown up challenges on account of COVID-19 for the pharma and the healthcare industry. There have also been interesting developments at the policy and the regulatory sphere. There's been march of technology. So there are a lot of legal issues that have really gathered center stage. What have your experiences been? I know it's an open-ended question, but really speaking, we would like to know, we would like to kickstart this panel by getting a sense of what exactly it is that has impacted a company and how you have sort of dealt with those issues and what do you perceive to be the future of this industry, henceforth. Over to you, Meera.
So thanks, Abhishek, for the opening question. But firstly, a very good evening to all the co-panelists and all the participants. It's a privilege to be on this session. Also, I represent my personal views here, and I do not represent the views of Abbott, the organization that I currently work for. So just would like to make that very clear. So yes, it's the time of new normal. The COVID pandemic in the last 2 years has hit all of us pretty bad. And for the pharma industry, it has changed a lot, in terms of the way they used to work before. As you know, the sales and marketing piece and the MRs of the pharma industry are really the heart and soul of any pharma industry. But when the lockdown was announced, everybody had to work from home, including the medical reps. And there was very little connect that you could have with your doctors or healthcare professionals. So a lot of this led to a sudden change in the way we connected. And that change was nothing but digitization. And today, even we are on a virtual online platform conducting a congress, right? And that was a change which kind of swept in through various industries, including the pharma industry, maybe in a matter of days. And what it did for the pharma industry is there are three main critical verticals of the pharma industry. One is, of course, the healthcare professionals to whom the company markets its products. So suddenly people had to connect with doctors online. They had to try and see if they could make mobile connections with them. So as an and different organizations have different compliance policies around how you connect with doctors. And for the first biggest challenge was, how do you get their consents on email, right? There is really no law around it. But if you want to connect with somebody and you want to send them some information to and fro to doctors, you at least need to get their email information, their email IDs, and get their consent so that they're happy to receive it. So I think that was a big challenge and a big change for us. People had their mobile numbers of doctors, but WhatsApp was not supposed to be a really official means of communication for security reasons. So email was the way to go, and it took some time for pharma companies to kind of gather the data. What we also saw mushrooming is a lot of companies, who provided these platforms with solutions through which you could disseminate a lot of information, you could hold CMEs. And the positive part is that at one point you could have many participants. So I think the outreach was really far and strong and wide in that sense. So that was one of the positives. From a trade perspective, I think this also helped us reach out to tier 2, tier 3 cities through the various platforms that were available in the market and the solutions. And for consumers, I think the most important piece for consumers were, there were certain, most consumers, like all of us, have faced this, right? During the pandemic, if we wanted to order anything, it was always online. So e-pharmacy definitely took the center stage for us. And working with e-pharmacies, understanding the challenges with e-pharmacies was one of the critical piece from a consumer or a patient standpoint. I'd just like to dwell upon, the law on e-pharmacies, because it's not, we don't, the rules are not yet in effect. They've just been notified. So with regard to e-pharmacies, you have seen a lot of the online pharmacies like 1mg and, the other pharmacies mushrooming, and they've been there for a while now, but suddenly they took center stage. They became very important. But at the same time, you also saw your regular medical store guy very happily willing to come home and deliver medicines to you, right? So there were these two kinds of things that the change that really came about. Now, in terms of the e-pharmacy legislations, initially, e-pharmacy is not recognized under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, because you have to recognize the Drugs and Cosmetics Act was notified in 1940. So it's a very old act. And there's no concept of e-pharmacy recognized under the act. And in December of 2015, the government, the DCGI's office issued a notification saying that, if online pharmacies want to conduct business, then they have to get a license under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And many online pharmacies went out and tried to do that. There are two types of e-pharmacies. One is, of course, the marketplace e-pharmacy, which apparently they call themselves marketplace, because what they do is they just connect you with various retailers and they give you the platform. And then there is the inventory model e-pharmacy, which basically stores the products at a place and then has a platform and a solution as well on which you can book. So there are these two fundamental differences in the e-pharmacy kinds of e-pharmacy. What also happened here is that, once the DCGI issued a notification and online pharmacies had to get licenses, this also led to two conflicting judgments, one a Delhi High Court judgment and one a Madras High Court judgment. So Delhi High Court judgment held that, online pharmacies could operate if they got licenses from under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, whereas the Madras High Court held that the pharmacies, which were basically the marketplace pharmacies, they got an immunity under the Information Technology Act, because they were not really selling, but they were just creating a platform and having a platform where buyers and sellers could meet. So the Madras High Court, in fact, said that in the light of the pandemic, online pharmacies should be permitted. And then that led, after some time, the e-pharmacy rules got notified. But what is important is that e-pharmacies are here to stay. And I think it is very important to have the rules notified at the earliest, because today it's the new normal. It's what we, it's become routine for us, right? On March 20th, 2020, the government also issued a notification where it recognized that retail pharmacies could also do doorstep deliveries. So the doorstep delivery by retail pharmacies got a legal sanction, which was not there earlier. And you can see a lot of it mushrooming in your own areas with your medical stores. And again, retail pharmacies have licenses, right? So there is this whole dilemma whether e-pharmacies, if they have licenses under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, are they completely covered? Or now, do they have to also take registration under the e-pharmacy rules, where it's become necessary to get registered? There have been issues with e-pharmacies, because e-pharmacies don't take the responsibility if, because it's a platform available where sellers and buyers meet. So they definitely, sometimes there are issues of counterfeit, there are issues of products being sold at much higher prices than the MRP. And I think these are serious concerns, and some action needs to be taken in this regard, in the interest of patient and consumer safety, right? And since this is here to stay, I think it will be very good if the rules get notified, and responsibility is cast on the e-pharmacies as to what do they need to do and what is the due diligence that they are required to do to ensure that the patient gets the correct medication. Because if you always also see today, if you want to check on any drug and you go to Google and do a search, you will always get some information also about the medication, right? And again, this information, is it really from the literature? Is it correct? Or is it something being put by the pharmacy? So these are all issues that it has opened up. And there is no law that is kind of governing these things. But if in case tomorrow something were to happen where somebody has an adverse event and takes a medicine reading the literature, how do you address that? Who's going to be responsible? So this is, in light of the fact that self-medication has also become a norm for, people have been taking a lot of multivitamins and all of that in the COVID space. It's very important that there is responsible sale of medications through the e-pharmacies. So this is on the e-pharmacy piece. I'd like to stop here if anybody else on the panel wants to add on.
Meera, it's quite interesting how perhaps we can try and draw parallels. And I don't know whether this is really going to be an appropriate example that I'm giving, but in the case of the content that is being put on platforms, we have the newly issued IT intermediary guidelines in February 2021, and they demarcate the principles of liability as those which are purely intermediaries and those that are related to content. And within content, they're essentially, of course, they've demarcated against their news publishers and curated content providers. If there is, even in relation to the online pharmacy space, if there is a distinction made, as perhaps the courts tried to bring about, with those people merely acting as facilitators and true intermediaries, where there is only a transaction that is taking place, and put them in the category of true intermediaries, and then look at those that are actually playing a role in the process of distribution of medication, and therefore they need to exercise a greater amount of due diligence, and therefore to impose certain stringent conditions upon them, akin to what in the entertainment space relates to the curated content providers. Because when you are curating the content, you are actually making a concerted decision as to what goes on your platform and what does not. Now, clearly, entertainment content is far removed from pharmaceuticals, because the impact of something going wrong in either of the cases is drastically different. One will just end up people being upset with what they're watching, versus something else could, ruin your life in terms of health-wise. So I guess, perhaps one of the aspects that this panel is throwing up for consideration is as to how that regulation has to sort of come about.
Yeah, so but, that's sorry, yeah, go ahead, Abhishek.
No. So, I actually wanted to move to the next, because if you have something additional to point out, because sure.
So also I'd like to, so you rightly mentioned it, curated content is very important, because a lot of us tend to read what's on there and make decisions and self-medicate, which could have implications. And many of the drugs are under Schedule H of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, and, advertisement is not allowed. So when you go to 1mg and you see all that data, will it amount to advertisement? And then you see, similar products being thrown up of other companies. What does that amount to? So there are many of these gray areas which need to get addressed, which have really not been addressed, because this is something new to the industry, and this is going to be the future any which ways, right? So we need to build something around it. Other than that, just on the pharma side, of course, a good move by the government was to bring medical devices under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And today all medical devices are considered to be drugs under the Act. And they have tried to restrict the pricing of medical devices. In fact, during the COVID pandemic, 5 key devices such as glucometer, digital thermometer, were all, the trade margins were defined for these particular 5 items: oximeter, blood pressure monitor, nebulizer. I think that was a good move, because we did see at some point masks and oximeters being sold at a exponentially high price. So I think that was a good move by the government to bring it in. So medical devices going forward are definitely going to fall within the purview of pricing. The other thing is on OTC, which is the OTC bill, over the counter bill, for advertisement, firstly for medications which you can buy over the counter, like for example, multivitamins are something that people normally pick up over the counter, paracetamol and all of these kind of medications. So there is a bill in the OFIC, and that bill will define how to, it will basically regularize the sale of these drugs, and also the kind of advertisement that you can do around these medications. So I think it's a good move overall. And we see, pharma is anyways regulated, but we see good regulations coming in place, which are only going to benefit the consumer.
Thanks. That's an amazing summary of, and there is a lot of material that you've put out there for us to digest and sort of mull over. And clearly, the um, whatever the challenge that is thrown by circumstances or by environment, ultimately, we always do want that the law and the regulation should be one step ahead. But sometimes there's a lot of catching up to do. So perhaps this is the time when those things will come about. But moving to Dr. Ganapathy, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and we're really blessed to have you amongst us and to share your knowledge and experiences in the field of telemedicine, where you have so much of experience in. And it's also become a buzzword, specifically after the pandemic hit us all. Um, could you please enlighten us on the ethical, the practical, and the regulatory issues surrounding the telemedicine area?
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's essential that you must have some idea of the background. Now, I started telemedicine in 1999, and the first 15 years we spent more in evangelization. Telemedicine then was a dirty word, and we had to convince everybody that distance is meaningless today, that geography has become history. We honestly never expected a strand of RNA to act as a global CTO, if you want to call it, a chief transformation officer. And within the last 10 months, all over the world, contactless medicine, I personally don't like the word telemedicine. I think telehealth is more appropriate. Okay. So the telehealth today has grown exponentially, a radical transformation. We were growing incrementally, say 5 to 10% every year. But believe me, in the last 18 months, I don't have exact statistics, but in India alone, it has probably grown at least 30x, 30 times of what it was just 18 months ago. Now, those of us who are actively involved in telemedicine, we are convinced that this is not a necessity-based, forced way because of lockdown, partial lockdown, etc. You cannot physically go and have a face-to-face consultation, and therefore consultations must be done through video conferencing, telephones, WhatsApp, what have you. Yes, they did contribute, but now that has sort of settled down, and our gut feeling is that at least 60% of people will continue to embrace virtual teleconsults, even if the pandemic is denotified at some stage in the future. Now, I am the only clinician in this panel. I'm a medical doctor, was a practicing doctor for 45 years. I would like to stress to the legal profession and those in the audience who are primarily based on regulations, etc., that with the acute shortage of doctors in India, particularly, there's a tremendous shortage. A doctor should be spending his time interacting with the patient, trying to help the patient, make a diagnosis, treat, keep him well, etc. In the United States, unfortunately, thanks to HIPAA, regulations, insurance, they're paranoid. That's a word I use. They're absolutely paranoid. Most doctors spend 40% of their time in paperwork. We hope that India will not fall into that. Now, till March 24, 2020, the teleconsultation itself was a gray area. Many of us said, let's face the problem when it comes. And luckily, on March 24th, thanks again to the pandemic, the government of India formally notified what are called the telemedicine practice guidelines, which unambiguously, very clearly stated and authorized any RMP, registered medical practitioner, in any state medical council or in the Medical Council of India to provide virtual consultations anywhere within the geographic limits of India. At that time, it was the then Medical Council of India, but within a few months, the Homeopathy Council, Unani, Siddha, Ayurveda, the so-called alternative systems of medicine, their respective councils also legalized this. So today, the position is very clear. Now, rather than going to the details of the telemedicine practice guidelines, I want to give a very reassuring note, particularly to medical doctors, if any listening here. Throughout the practice guidelines, it is unambiguously reiterated again and again and again that the entire regulatory rules, if you want to call it, is entirely contextual. In other words, it is a professional judgment of the teleconsultant at that point of time, on that day, And for that person, under the then prevailing circumstances, I and I alone, a registered medical practitioner, can make a judgment whether I will give a teleconsultation or not, whether a face-to-face consultation is mandatory, whether an emergency teleconsult can be given, what drug is to be prescribed, whether an ultrasound, CT scan, MRI, investigations, etc., etc., etc. In other words, they've repeatedly emphasized that it is entirely contextual. Now, just to give you an example, now I work at the Apollo Hospitals, a quaternary care center with state-of-the-art medical equipment. I have all the infrastructure in the world. Now, I'm an old-fashioned clinician. I belong to the BC era. I'm not talking of before Corona, I'm talking of before computers. I was the last neurosurgeon in the country who was trained before a computer even came to a hospital in the late 70s. Now, I would not be willing to make a clinical decision unless I do a rectal examination to find out if the prostate is enlarged or not, or if the patient has piles or something like that. And therefore, I would not proceed with a teleconsultation. On the other hand, my student who is well trained in 4D and 5D state-of-the-art ultrasound may be much more comfortable in interpreting an ultrasound and may do away with the necessity of putting his hand on the abdomen even. He may think palpation is not necessary at all. An echocardiogram would suffice for him, whereas an old-fashioned doctor may like to auscultate with a stethoscope. So both of us are right. So the point is, it is contextual all the way. So far as consent is concerned, the practice guidelines very clearly state it's an implied consent, which means that when the initiative is taken by a patient to consult me virtually, I do not require a formal consent, just as in a face-to-face consultation. Again, the guidelines are very clear that they divide consultations into 4 groups: a patient RMP consultation, healthcare provider, interestingly. So, for example, a person is demented, person with Parkinsonism, or even a child, etc. Somebody is looking after the patient, not the patient himself. That patient can consult me online. Similarly, an RMP to RMP consultations are also allowed. However, the telemedicine practice guidelines is very silent on the legality or otherwise of an RMP physically located in India, whether I'm authorized to give a consultation to a patient outside India, either an Indian or a foreigner, a foreign citizen, etc. The law is not very silent on that. Most of us still do it. We are hoping that it will be interpreted only on a contextually. Finally, I would like to reiterate again and again that the medical doctor should not be overwhelmed by these regulations, rules, guidelines. As the very word implies, it is a guideline, no more, no less. Now, as a rough guesstimate, now the Apollo Hospitals, I have personally, my team, my staff has overseen almost 3 million teleconsultations. Most of this are public-private partnership through various state governments. We now do 10,000 teleconsults a day. In ophthalmology, Shankar Nethralaya, Arvind Eye Hospital, the 2 biggest players, they do about 6,000 per day. As a guesstimate, at least 10 million teleconsultations would have been done in the last couple of years, particularly. To the best of my knowledge, there has not been a single test case before a consumer protection forum or before any judiciary, etc. The interesting point, the only case filed where the telemedicine practice guidelines was quoted and a psychiatrist was accused of violating the telemedicine practice guidelines, as Meera just mentioned about e-prescription, about different listing of drugs. This particular psychiatrist had prescribed drugs, antipsychotic drugs, which the present telemedicine practice guidelines prohibitively prevents you from giving an e-prescription unless you have physically seen the patient within the previous 6 months and it is a refill. You are not allowed to prescribe a new drug. So this was a very famous actor. I don't want to mention the name. A couple of months ago, a very famous actor died and the case is still going on. So the defense said that the psychiatrist had committed a mistake by giving an e-prescription. So accepting this single instance, there has not been a single case which has come to court. And believe me, over 45 years of neurosurgical practice, and based on all my friends and all, I have a very good idea. Even though the media makes a big highlight and says case filed against so and so, malpractice, so and so, so and so, so and so, if you look at the denominator, it is less than 1 in 200,000. For every 200,000 face-to-face consultations given, less than one ends up in a consumer protection forum. No patient, believe me, no patient will seek legal redress unless he has been annoyed, unless you have irritated him, unless you have made him very, very angry. A bad result or an unexpected result alone will not make a patient go. So what we tell everybody is, all that is required is excellent communication, honesty, integrity, sincerity. I certainly have made many, many mistakes during my 4 decades of neurosurgical practice, but I have not had a single instance where somebody has gone to court. That is because as an anticipatory bail, to use your own language, I tell the patient, look, this could go wrong, this goes wrong. And if something did go wrong, I would go tell the family what exactly happened. And this will ensure that they do not seek legal redress. So the moral of the story as an end user for a medical doctor is not to get overwhelmed, irrespective of what your good legal friends tell you, not to get overwhelmed. Do what you think is best for that particular patient on that day, at that time, under those circumstances. Exercise your professional judgment. Of course, be aware of privacy, security, be aware of all the rules, regulations, take consent, store the data, etc., etc. Another final point I would like to mention is technology is evolving so fast. The law can, all over the world, not only India, the law can never, ever keep up with technology. For example, artificial intelligence. We have already started using AI, chatbots, etc. There is absolutely no rule. 1 and 2, all of us are familiar. In fact, medical doctors always quote this. We get very angry when everybody accuses us of that and this. But then in a court of law, you find the lower court gives one ruling, the higher court reverses that ruling, a still higher court gives a third ruling, a 5-bench gives a ruling different from a 3-bench, and so on and so forth. In other words, of the existing law, of the same law, the law has not been changed. It's an interpretation of the law. Interpretations can differ. Similarly, interpretations can also differ from doctor to doctor, from specialist to specialist. So I don't think as a medical doctor, as a practicing telemedicine person, I am not going to be overawed by the absence or presence of any rule, so long as my conscience is clear and I do what I think is the best for the patient from a contextual basis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ganapathy, for that really, passionate basis, not only for proliferation of teleconsultations and telehealth in India, but also from the point of view of the importance with which doctors need to trust their own judgment while taking calls on advising patients. And to my mind, as you yourself pointed out, there are interpretations to be taken across various fora depending upon the element or the level of discretion that can be exercised in a legal case, depending upon what precedent is followed where, etc. So the amount of the diligence or the level of expertise that even any legal profession, any professional brings in, whether it's a doctor or a lawyer, will have to be contextual. We are told that time and again, even when the courts lay down the law, they say that this is the general principles of the law, but in order to determine whether in a particular case or in another, these particular rules are applicable or they need to be interpreted in any manner would depend upon the facts of each case. And therefore, I absolutely agree with you on the aspect that when a decision is being taken by a medical professional, they need to be contextual. It needs to be in relation to that particular patient, in relation to whatever diagnosis is made. I'd like to move on to Abraham. A lot of the
Abhishek, sorry, just like to interject here,
Sure,
Dr.
sure,
Ganpati
please.
made a very
Yes,
important point. He said that, the law, technology is changing so fast that it's very difficult for the law to kind of keep pace with that. And so true, if you look at our data privacy bill itself, right? And today, because everything is, whether it's telemedicine, whether it's online pharmacy, whether it's online shopping, you're sharing so much of your data. And that is, that's a gold mine of data sitting out there. But our data privacy bill is still in the offing, and it's not yet notified. And this is going to later on raise many more concerns. But yes, many organizations and have started trying to build in various consents and various ring fence the risk, right? In light of the impending bill. But it's a very interesting point Dr. Ganpati made that the law is always chasing the change. It's not the other way around.
So,
Thankfully,
Abhishek, if I
Meera,
can add
sorry.
just one point.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Can I
see-
interject for a minute, please? This is Atulya. So
Yes, sure.
we in Max Healthcare have had a very extensive experience of telemedicine. We were probably one of the first few people who started using a proper technology-based platform for teleconsults. And of course, COVID was a facilitator, and the government came up with the guidelines, as Dr. Ganpati mentioned, on the 25th of March 2020. There was a lacuna, I would say, or gray area on the extent on which doctors' clinical examination was required, and there was some observations in a Bombay High Court judgment, and normally one would not feel very safe to advise a patient directly before this, and you would probably want a practicing doctor be co-located with the patient, so that you are advising a doctor just to be safe. But I think all of that is behind us. The point on doctors making, I think the guidelines need to be read once. They are, of course, guidelines, but I think they're very helpful. So they do encourage doctors. In fact, they clearly state that a doctor can take, it's the same duty of care as he has otherwise. So I don't think they need to feel any different. And it's their judgment whether a clinical examination is required or not. So clearly, I totally agree with what Dr. Ganpati has said. And there are, of course, areas where specific prescriptions, etc., are prohibited. So I think there is a broad framework. I would probably want to add that the guidelines will not cover international advisory per se. I'm not saying there's anything against it, at least from an Indian law perspective. So that's my few bits on, and I totally agree with what Dr. Ganpati has said.
Before Dr. Ganpati, he wanted to add another point, but before I hand it over to him for that, the last point that you raised about cross-border references, etc. In my view, I agree with you. First of all, let me just say that. But the interesting part is that's actually going to be, to my mind, the hotbed for a lot of regulatory and possibly advisory sort of roles, because at least in the last a month or so, I have received 5 different queries purely along those lines. And just to sort of complete that aspect of the efficacy or the basis of reliance on the TPG, the telemedicine practice guidelines. Whereas as you and Dr. Ganpati mentioned, these are guidelines. However, they have been, and the notification specifically says so, that they've been read into the Code of Medical Ethics. So
Yes.
therefore, they have the sanctity of law to that extent. But
No,
the
they
good
are
part
under
is,
the
rather
MCA.
than
They're issued under the MCA. Yes.
yeah, so the only good part is that it has been recognized by the Niti Aayog and the powers that be, that given the dynamic nature of this developing, if I can call it an industry and or profession or practice, thankfully it's been notified in the form of guidelines, so that the independence still exists to a large extent of modification or amendment being brought about, rather than every time having to go to Parliament and seeking that modification. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Ganpati, who wanted to make a point. Sorry.
Yeah, just 2 things. In the event of negligence being established during the process of a teleconsultation, one of the major problems that's going to ensue is sharing of liability. As a medical doctor, I would wash my hands off and say the video quality was not good, the audio quality was not good, and I am not responsible for this. The network operator is responsible, or the video conferencing camera, etc., etc., etc. Hardware, software, there are at least, unlike a face-to-face consultation, here there are at least 5 to 6 players who coexist to share the ultimate product. That is number one. Number two is, just since you mentioned cross-border, I'm sure you're aware of it probably, the Abu Dhabi Health Authority has categorically stated that it is illegal for any citizen of Abu Dhabi to get a teleconsultation from any doctor anywhere outside Abu Dhabi unless that doctor is registered with the Abu Dhabi Health Authority. Now, we have several patients from Abu Dhabi, so I sent my doctors, I told them to get themselves registered, but the process was so cumbersome, and no doctor with 35 years experience wants to be examined by a local doctor who passed out 2 years ago, etc., etc. So these are some of the things. South Korea, the same problem. So I don't know how they're going to enforce it. I don't know how they can punish me for giving a teleconsultation to Abu Dhabi, but the local citizen can be punished. So number one, the one more issue which the European Union has come to an agreement several, maybe decades ago, is where is the point of action? Now, I am a doctor in Madras. My patient is in Ludhiana. He files the suit where? In a court in Ludhiana or a court in Chennai. So that, I think all these things need to be addressed so far as India is concerned. Of course, the European Union has given very clear rules where the patient resides. That is the point where the complaint has to be filed. So there are at least 100 different questions which need. You see, Confucius said the greatest fool can ask more questions than the wisest man can answer. So I can definitely ask at least 100 questions which has not been answered here. But having said that, the Telemedicine Society of India is working on it. We will be submitting, we hope the government will bring out a version 2.0 within a year or so, where a lot of feedback will be taken and things will get better. Thank you very much for this, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ganapathy. And at least I do not consider myself to be a wise person at all, but at least one part of your question, possibly I can try and answer with regard to, the location of where the matter could possibly be instituted. Thankfully, even though it is something which was formulated in 1908, our Code of Civil Procedure provides for this very interesting concept of cause of action. So if the cause of action arises either in whole or in part, in your perhaps example, certainly in Ludhiana, because that's where the patient received the treatment and as a result.
Sorry, but I am giving the treatment from Madras.
So from a plaintiff's point of view, he's receiving the treatment in Ludhiana, and the cause of action, at least in part, I'm not saying maybe completely, it arises in part in Chennai, also in Ludhiana. So the patient will have the option of suing, certainly can come to Chennai and sue the doctor there because the doctor resides there, and the defendant's place of residence or business is certainly one of the basis for suing the patient. Okay. But otherwise, the plaintiff can also sue you in Ludhiana. But anyway, sorry. Okay. But I agree with you that those are aspects that will come up more and more often.
One point on Consumer Protection Act, I think that will enable him to sue where he works in addition to both the locations.
I deliberately chose not to answer that because I was hoping to put that question to Abraham.
But has health been removed? Has healthcare been removed from the consumer protection now? A couple of weeks ago?
No. I think Dr. Ganapathy, that is something which I will talk upon during my point when I'm just throwing a little light on consumer protection.
Yes. So over to you, Abraham. Very frankly, new normal, lot of interesting stuff happening. Telemedicine, teleconsult, privacy concerns. So, from the point of view of how would you mitigate risk for an organization and in order to ensure sustainability? That's one clear question to you. And more importantly, since it sort of segues very well into how the conversation was going, I would like you to start with addressing your thoughts on the Consumer Protection Act of 2019 and the notification that have been issued thereafter. Over to you, Abraham.
Good evening, all, and thank you, Abhishek, for having me, and thank you all for having me. My view here is similar to what Meera has said from a representation perspective. Now,
just 1 second, sorry, I'm coming in here. Your voice is not very clear. If you could come a little closer to the.
Is
Much
it clear?
better. Much better.
Okay. So, good evening all once again, and thank you for having me. And my views are of my personal point, and it has no bearing to my organization, similar to what Mira also said. And that's a standard disclaimer what I believe lawyers give now, just to safeguard any issues coming up. But having said that, I'm going to touch upon consumer protection later. I'm just going to go into the risk management part first. What is the new norm? The new norm basically was we had an unprecedented time. It had a lot of disruptions. The disruptions created a lot of challenges for us. And that came a stage wherein we had to respond, we had to recover, and we had to thrive. I wouldn't say that we are thriving. I would say that, okay, we're reaching there. And the reason why I state that is because if you look at India's situation today, on the global demand on vaccines with respect to supply, 50% is catered by India. We are the third largest drug manufacturers in the world. Vaccine production from a global perspective, technically they say that 60% is done in India. So yes, that is a new norm. With the new norm, everybody has talked about challenges, liabilities, all aspects. So what is the most important thing for an organization or for an entity? It's risk management. If there is no risk management, there won't be a sustainability model for every action what you all are speaking over here. An organization needs to have a risk management which identifies various categories of risk and you mitigate it. I'm not going to get into the mitigation factors. It wouldn't be right for me to comment on that. Mitigation factors depend upon organization to organization. But I do know for a fact that the few points what we need to touch in every organization to mitigate a risk starts with how do you handle crisis? How do you handle a crisis management? There are plays in over there. You work up with scenarios. You put in measures to ensure that in case there is a scenario, how do you avoid that or how you mitigate the risk? People management was a big concern, and it's going to be a concern going forward also. Same as with respect to compliance to labor laws. You don't know what the respective labor commissioners are going to say with respect to retrenchment or layoff of people or in terms of even hiring people. Then you have, but the major concern what I see, and it has happened for various industries, is cybersecurity. It's a remote working area. And how secure is it? Now, under cybersecurity, there have been multiple issues. That is staying secure, and what about the productivity of the employees? What is the data? What is the disaster recovery process? What an organization has done? Now, there are a couple of things. Data theft has been a concern. Phishing has been a concern. What not? Now, when you move from there, supply chain has been disrupted for some time now. Be it in terms of the plant, be it in terms of the warehouse, be it in terms of the availability of raw materials. Now, R&D has been impacted. Insurance, we need to look into. We needed to discuss with the insurance companies to understand whether a claim will be admissible or not. Finance from a money flow perspective. Now, these were the risk elements. I'm just giving the highlights of the risk elements which an organization needs to look into. In terms of what Dr. Ganapathy said, see, tomorrow if there's a case of negligence, I'm going to blame everybody else who's part of it. Now, the only way an organization can defend a claim is if they have a risk mitigation in place, because that will basically tell them what is to be done in scenarios. Now, having said that, I'm just going to move a little ahead from and I know the time is of the essence over here, move into consumer protection. I was an IT hardware lawyer, so consumer protection was bread and butter. Now I moved into pharma thinking that consumer law will not per se come in, but then it is going to be there for a good time. And the new consumer protection law, what I feel is that I'm not going to get into the entirety, but few aspects. The concept of product liability has been introduced, which has been defined, which has never been in India in the past. It's been defined and it includes products and services. the concept of e-commerce has come in. The concept of Central Consumer Protection Authority has come in, which is a regulatory body which was not there in the past. And then you have, even in terms, and now Dr. Ganapathy coming in terms of the question which you had asked, in terms of healthcare. In the draft, I believe healthcare was there, then there was a lot of opposition and it was removed. But the interesting part of it is, there is a case which you might be also aware, will be Shanta case. Shanta case, I believe 1996 Supreme Court had stated that healthcare services comes under the definition of services. Now, even in the present scenario, we don't know whether this logic is going to apply. It's going to be tested and it can be argued either ways. But one needs to also remember that last time also in the previous regulation also healthcare was not mentioned, but it was agreed. So that is what I just wanted to briefly touch upon. I'm happy to take any questions, but the most important thing is risk management is critical for any organization to go forward in this new norm, and if we need to reach that thrive stage.
Thanks so much, Abraham, not only for your views, but for putting it so succinctly and helping us in managing what I had committed to manage in the beginning. It is the run rate and the over rate with regard to our session. And with your last few words, I'll hand it over to Atulya with a specific question. Abraham says that in this new normal, it is going to be a lot is going to depend upon risk mitigation and handling of those risks. In the last 1.5 years or so, Atulya, what has your experience been specifically from the risk mitigation point of view in the light of, let's say, the regulatory challenges, the investigations, the litigations, and what has surrounded and impacted the industry, more so healthcare industry, and your views on that? Thanks.
Sure. So before I start on the regulatory sort of landscape, it's a huge event. I mean, it's a huge topic on itself, and in fact, there are subtopics to it which are enough for such sessions. I want to comment that as far as my understanding is concerned, I have absolutely no doubt that the new Consumer Protection Act covers healthcare. So I have absolutely no doubt. So, I mean, we can fight about it, we can try to challenge it, but I no doubt that we are covered. It's unfortunate. I would not want it, of course. So moving on to the regulatory, so risk mitigation is the essence. I totally agree with that aspect. I just want to share some of the experiences that we've had, in healthcare, not from the pharma perspective, but actually at a real hospital, that experience, and of course, all of this is personal, as everybody has been saying. I'm not attributing it to any particular, places, but of course, I have exposures only where I'm working or associated with. So, I have never seen in my career, which is almost 30 years now, so much of regulation. Every single day, the landscape was changing, whether it was capping on testing, whether it was, us going to the Supreme Court, challenging it, all that process was different from before. And then fresh regulations, whether it was acquisitions of hospitals, beds, hotels, all of that, the manner in which it was done, and the price capping, which was, different in one state from the other state. There were controversies around whether TPA insurances are covered, or there was some silence around that in some other places. so it has led to an enormous amount of patient-related acrimony and subsequent overcharging related regulatory action and investigations. I think the core of all of that, unfortunately, is that it was a situation where the regulators exercised their powers in the best interest of the people, but I think all those regulations were probably not very well drafted, could not understand their impact, had to keep on changing. And I think the disease itself was such that nobody really expected it to last so long. I mean, we all wish it doesn't come, but a lot of people are already saying that the third wave is on the onset already. So, so I think it's an amazing time. There's been a lot of setback for several businesses. There has been a recalibration. Healthcare has had to work very differently. A hospital, which is a tertiary, quaternary healthcare facility with top kind of specialists from all sort of various functions of specialties of medicine, suddenly been converted into a COVID center, which is a very basic treatment. It's very important. There's a huge setback on and the fact is that the number of beds are only that many, and they have been acquired to fight the pandemic. And government probably felt that it was the responsibility of private sector to step in, and and they called it augmentation. I don't personally feel that is augmentation. Augmentation to me means that you increase or enhance something. You actually stopped other treatments and focus to it, which was essential. I'm not faulting with it, but I think so. It's a so that's the landscape. The landscape is socio-political. The landscape is of all these regulations. They're all issued in some sort of a hurry. There has been silence on TPA coverage at times, where the patients ended up, and then some of the hospitals were told that initially when it started that you were not a COVID hospital and you can only refer to. And then, so there has been a lot of evolution around how to take it. But I think all of that is learned. The good point is that everybody has been working on this together, the hospital, the government, the various, regulatory bodies. So it's actually quite an emotional experience as well, wearing those suits and working in the hospital in heat, nurses, so much of sacrifice, doctors losing life, it's an amazing, unthinkable, if you asked me beginning 2020, I wouldn't even dream that something like this would happen. So having said that, I think we've all come back with different models. We have to recalibrate every 6 months from COVID to non-COVID, do away with segregations, build up the entire facilities again. So it's been very challenging operating environment. But I think some hospitals have reacted very well to it and have been able to cope up with that environment. And in all of this, there can be misses of compliance, regulatory, following everything, so that's been the, frauds, etc. That's been the background. During the peak of the second wave of COVID in Delhi, most of the super specialty hospitals witnessed a wave of regulatory inquisitions, among others, which I've already mentioned, was also from CCI. And, they had their own targets and they wanted responses in a very timely manner. The whole so-called first line of the corona warriors were actually busy saving lives, and they had to pull themselves out to respond to the regulator. My personal view is that it was not very compassionate, thought well, timing, so to say. But I think it must have been very important, I'm sure. So that's my, so the experience in that has been very good, in the sense that depositions have been permitted online. There has not been any insistence of making depositions on the physically. They have there's a protocol to be followed. Strict data protection and regulations and undertakings and affidavits need to be filed. The number of people, the recording, everything is done very well. So thinking of such depositions in India, that they would come so quickly, so there's a huge technological leap that we have taken in investigations. So I think from that perspective, it's an excellent move. It is convenient, it is transparent, it is fully documented, it is fully, so there is no there is no closed door where somebody is being aggressive to someone and taking a statement. So people are in their own respective work environments. The number of people in that room are disclosed, and the questions are both in writing and are recorded. So I think it's an excellent, transparent investigation. So I have, I'm very supportive of this. Then of course, I mean, there have been instances when the crisis happened. I can recollect in Delhi, there was a huge oxygen shortage. And I think 21st of April, Government of India came up with the regulation of allocation of oxygen, to various states. And the same day it was challenged by us in the High Court. And we were on various locations in the country. And we hooked up on a line just like this conference today. And we briefed the council. We said that it was emergency. We said that 6 hours later, people will begin to die in hospitals because of shortage of oxygen. We knocked the door of the High Court of Delhi, I think at 6 p.m. at night, in the evening. And I think by 9, we had relevant orders. And I think at 11, we had delivery in one of our hospitals, which was really suffering with the relevant oxygen. So I think technology, it was unthinkable. All of this was unthinkable before. So this is a huge enabler. So COVID has taught us to do things effectively. COVID, we had a lot of debate on doing anything before, but I think all that debate is cut. A lot of people have accepted that this is a way to do it and this is how it should be done. So I think that's a great point. The other business opportunity, like we've already discussed, enhanced on the telemedicine field, has been something what you can call, the home care business. So what in Max Healthcare, it is called Max at Home, or whatever version it may be. And I think it has grown exponentially all across. I think I don't have the numbers that it is 300% as Dr. Ganpati spoke about telemedicine in India, but I wouldn't be surprised it was similar growth. And of course, where COVID could not be treated, hospitalization was mandatory as per the regulations, but regulations initially permitted mild, and then they permitted even moderate. And then there were restrictions on comorbidities, and then certain level of comorbidities were also regulatory permitted to be addressed at home. And I think that was real augmentation of the number of beds, etc., that were happened, and that was very good care, because the results that at least I have from were almost 100%. So it's of course they were not very severe patients, but I think and I would the stickiness of it is there. I would not doubt that these businesses were only riding on the wave of COVID. I think this is something which will stay with us post-COVID, and I think the regulatory framework that sort of facilitated it was most welcome. But
Atulya, you went on mute a bit, but and I swear to you, it is not deliberate. It is not to cut you off, but if you have a couple of other points to complete, because then we'll be completing our session and moving on to the next one.
No, I just said that that is perfectly what all I had to say. Nothing more to say. But I'm happy if there are any questions or any interest from anyone, later on or now, to respond to any of the areas of interest from co-panelists or anybody in the audience.
We would have loved to do that, Atulya. Unfortunately, we will have to take that offline because as there were these time overruns with the earlier sessions as well, so we also got caught in that. But thank you so much for a great session. Unfortunately, Dr. Ganapathy had to log off; he had another engagement. But thank you, Meera. Thanks so much, Atulya, and thank you so very much, Abraham, for making this session an extremely engaging one. It was very informative. I know we need at least 2 more days to complete what all we want to say and to discuss and to have different points in view. But unfortunately, that's what we will have to do with. Thank you so much once again, Legalira, and over to you, Shikha.